For years, he drove through the city's chaos quiet, punctual, unnoticed. The passengers barely looked at him, just another man in a uniform, steering a bus full of people who had somewhere better to be. Until one rainy Tuesday morning, a military sergeant climbed aboard, scanned the cabin, then stopped frozen at the sight of the driver. He clicked his heels, saluted, and said just one word. The entire bus fell silent, and in that moment, everyone realized they'd been riding with someone they never truly saw. Gerald Muller woke before the city, not just before the streets stirred or the bakeries opened, but before the birds themselves dared cry morning. His alarm clock didn't need to beep. His body, trained through years of discipline and routine, rose with a silent certainty. It was always 4:45 a.m. He moved carefully, quietly, as though not to disturb the stillness he respected. The kettle boiled while he folded his shirt cuffs to slices of rye bread, a smear of butter, and one strong, scalding cup of black coffee. He always sat at the same corner of his tiny kitchen table, in the same worn chair, with the same solemn stare toward the small photo frame on the wall. A younger version of him stood tall beside a woman whose eyes smiled more than her lips did. They looked frozen in time like ghosts. His apartment was modest, clean, a row of perfectly folded towels, polished shoes by the door, a shelf of books, with the spines aligned by height. Gerald lived alone. No one had knocked on his door in years, except for the annual maintenance inspector. Even that man barely looked him in the eye, just handed over the clipboard and muttered something about pipes. He didn't mind. Gerald Muller had spent most of his life in silence. He wasn't seeking noise now. His uniform wasn't military anymore. It was navy blue, with a public transit patch stitched neatly into the shoulder. His boots weren't polished to army shine, but he cleaned them every night anyway. The city called him Driver 27. But his bus, the 63 line that ran from Nordstadt to the industrial edge of Hanover, was his domain. No one questioned his punctuality, his precision, or the way the engine purred just a bit quieter when he held the wheel. The depot was always the same: exhaust smoke, chatter about shift rotations, vending machines that spat coins. Gerald nodded to the few drivers who greeted him. Most didn't. He didn't mind that either. He'd seen the way young people now typed instead of talked. He'd seen the way silence became the new normal. He'd mastered it long before they needed it. He checked his clipboard. Line 63, 5:15 departure. Weather, overcast. School zone speed limits in effect. He noted every detail without being told. Gerald didn't just drive buses. He observed the world like a man used to watching borders. One small thing out of place could mean something. Not everyone saw the signs. He always did. The passengers trickled in. Always the same faces. Students with baggy eyes and headphones. Office workers in identical black coats. A woman with a lunch bag and aching knees. Some nodded at him. Fewer spoke. Most didn't look up. They were too busy scrolling, sipping, or just surviving. Gerald greeted them all with the same simple nod. He didn't force pleasantries, but he never failed to open the doors on time. Never took a wrong turn. Never raised his voice to them. He was just a presence, a mechanical part of the morning, and yet he noticed everything. He saw the boy with the bruised knuckles who always sat in the back, the girl who started boarding with a suitcase twice a week, the old man who used to wait at stop 9 but hadn't shown up in 3 days. Gerald saw them all, but no one saw him. It didn't hurt anymore. It just was. Years ago, he had worn a different uniform, olive green, emblems, insignias, brass buttons. He had not been a high officer, not someone remembered in textbooks, but he had led men in heat. In winter, in places the news never covered. He had been the one who kept voices low and heads down, the one others followed when orders got too quiet. He had not won medals, but he had saved lives. That chapter was folded away, not erased, just closed, like a file locked in a cabinet no one else could open. Now, he lived in service of quiet things. Clean transport, safe roads, steady hands. But the city changed. Faster cars, louder protests, a growing gap between the world he knew and the one around him. He didn't complain. He just adapted. Like always, one afternoon, a teenager tried to board without a ticket. The boy laughed when Gerald stopped him, said something sharp. But Gerald just looked at him, not with anger, but with a calm that unsettled. The boy hesitated, then paid. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Other drivers talked about it later, said Gerald had that old school energy. One called him the soldier bus driver. They laughed, but not unkindly. Still, no one asked, and Gerald never volunteered. At night, he returned to his apartment, always alone, always silent. His dinner, potatoes, cabbage, sausage. His drink, one beer, sometimes two. He read the paper cover to cover, highlighting articles with a red pen. Sometimes. He opened a wooden box on his shelf. Inside, 2 letters, both handwritten. One in shaky ink, the other clean block letters. He never read them aloud, but he remembered every word. Once a month, he took bus 63 on a slightly different route. Officially, it was a maintenance test. Unofficially, he drove past a care home in the Linden district. He parked, entered, sat beside an old woman, her eyes cloudy, her hands thin. She never spoke, neither did he. But for 40 minutes, he held her hand, then left. The staff never asked. They didn't need to. Then came the new passenger, a young man, mid-20s, military haircut, sat upright, always thanked Gerald, never used his phone, read maps, carried a duffel bag like it held something more than clothes. Gerald noticed, one morning, the young man saluted him when boarding, just a small nod of respect barely visible. But Gerald saw and returned it. A week later, a sergeant boarded. Not just any sergeant, his uniform crisp, boots clean, insignia shining. He was older than the young man, but not by much. He looked like someone used to command. Gerald felt something shift the moment he stepped aboard. The sergeant scanned the cabin, eyes alert. He walked down the aisle, paused, turned back, and locked eyes with Gerald. That's when it happened. The salute, not casual, not token, a formal, respectful salute, one that meant history. Passengers stopped mid-sentence. The young man on the bench sat taller, phones lowered. A heavy silence filled the bus, and Gerald? He returned it, with precision, with gravity. No one understood yet. But in that quiet moment, decades of silence bent into meaning, and the man they never truly saw became, suddenly, unforgettable. The salute changed everything. The moment was short, 10 seconds at most, but its weight lingered like incense. In a chapel, for the first time in years, the passengers truly saw Gerald. Not as a steering wheel fixture, not as background noise, but as someone who had once stood in places where salutes meant survival, sacrifice, and silence. But in the days that followed, confusion stirred, speculation bloomed, and where mystery grows, so too does discomfort. The next morning, 2 men in suits stood near the front of the bus, whispering about security clearances. A woman snapped a photo discreetly as she exited. Online forums for local transport workers began buzzing. Who's the old guy on line 63? Did you see that salute? Ex-military, Stasi, special ops? Gerald said nothing, drove his route, punched out, went home. But inside, something began to rustle, not fear, not pride. Something deeper, an ache he hadn't felt since his final post overseas, not because of recognition, but because silence, his lifelong shield, was no longer holding. The transit authority called him in for a brief review. It wasn't disciplinary, they assured him. Just a precaution. His file was immaculate. No accidents, no complaints, never late. But they were receiving inquiries. People were curious, and in the age of viral media, curiosity felt like instability. Just tell us a bit about your background, Herr Muller, the manager said, so we can, reassure the public. Gerald looked at the young man across the desk, hair slicked, tight, hands tapping a tablet. He wanted to laugh, but didn't. I was a sergeant, he said simply. In what branch? In the part that buried names. The young manager blinked, unsure if that was metaphor or threat. Back on the route, changes kept coming. People were talking. Some approached him now, asking about the military. A teenager asked if he'd ever killed someone. Gerald didn't answer. Another man offered to buy him coffee, just out of respect. Gerald declined. And then came the backlash. A local columnist published a piece questioning the appropriateness of ex-military men in sensitive public service roles. She referenced cases abroad where PTSD had led to incidents. Her article didn't name Gerald, but everyone knew. Comments followed. Why is a man like that behind the wheel of a school route? What if he snaps? Do we even know his past? The transit union remained neutral. The higher-ups sent a message about employee discretion and public confidence. It wasn't supportive. It wasn't condemning. It was distance. The new sergeant didn't return, nor did the young man with the duffel bag. Gerald suspected it had been intentional, a goodbye wrapped in a salute. But the public's need for certainty had no patience for silence. One morning, a woman refused to board his bus. She stood at the curb, stared at him, then shook her head, and waited for the next one. A mother asked her child to sit away from the front. A college student snapped a photo and tagged it, #invisible-threat. Gerald didn't respond. He drove. He nodded. He endured. But inside, the rustling turned into something heavier. Not shame, not regret, exhaustion. He had spent his youth in service, his middle age in obscurity, and now, in the final stretch of his working life, he found himself at the center of a narrative he had not written and did not want. One evening, he was called to HR again. "We've had a request to reassign you," the supervisor said. "It's voluntary, of course, a more remote route, fewer passengers, less exposure." Gerald stared at the floor, at the cheap blue carpet, at the corner where a stain was only half cleaned. "Less exposure," he repeated quietly. "It's not about you personally. It's just people react, and you don't give much context." He looked up. "I gave everything I had." That was context. The supervisor cleared her throat. "We're just asking for your cooperation." That night, Gerald didn't sleep. He stood by his window for hours, watching the shadows shift across his street. At dawn, he walked not to the depot, but to the cemetery in Linden. He stood before a small, plain headstone, no flowers, just a name, Anneliese Muller, and beneath it, carved faintly, "He never stopped serving." He stayed for 20 minutes, said nothing. When he returned to the depot, the schedule had already been changed. Line 63 no longer bore his name. Instead, they gave him Line 17, a loop near the outskirts. With fewer stops, mostly industrial zones, it was quieter, colder, further from the city, fewer faces, fewer stories. He accepted the keys without protest. But news travels, even on Line 17. One morning, a young woman boarded with her father, a retired colonel with a cane. When he saw Gerald, he froze. You're Muller, from 88, Sarajevo." Gerald didn't nod. He didn't smile. But he said yes. The man sat at the front. They rode in silence. At the end, the old colonel stood, saluted him, and whispered, "They forgot." "I didn't." That night, Gerald opened the wooden box again, removed the letter in block ink. It was from a soldier he had led through a collapsed field hospital. The last line read, "If not for you, I wouldn't be a father today." He folded it carefully, lit a candle, and let silence sit beside him like an old comrade. Outside, the world kept scrolling, kept judging, kept forgetting. But on that bus every morning one man kept driving. Not for attention, not for thanks, but because some duties never end. And some stories are meant to be lived, not told. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Gerald had been reassigned to the quieter route on the city's outskirts. No children screaming, no tourists asking directions, just early shift workers and silent fields. If peace had a sound, it was the hum of Line 17's tires along the misty roads at dawn. But peace is not the same as healing. Inside him, something old had been stirred, shaken loose by the salute, the whispers, the exile. He didn't miss the crowds. He missed being invisible in them. Now, every nod felt like pity. Every quiet morning, a reminder of how quickly a life of service could be reduced to suspicion. Until one Monday morning, just past 6 a.m., a figure waited at stop 17. Gerald almost didn't recognize him at first. The posture was looser, the haircut grown out. But when the young man stepped aboard and snapped his heels together with crisp precision, Gerald knew the young sergeant had returned. He boarded in silence, duffel at his side, and stood instead of sitting. Gerald kept his eyes on the road. Thought you were gone. Deployment changed. They reassigned me to the local base. You always stand when you ride buses. Only when I'm waiting for permission. Gerald gave the faintest nod. The young man sat. That day, he rode to the last stop, and the next morning, and the one after. Passengers began to notice the military duffel, the posture, the way he always thanked the driver. A rumor began to ripple again, but this time, it carried a different tone. Then came the anniversary. Gerald hadn't marked it. He never did. But that morning, as he approached the depot, he found something strange. His bus line 17 was cleaned, detailed, the signal light fixed. Inside, folded neatly on the dashboard, was a pressed white envelope. No name, just a unit insignia. He opened it in the driver's seat. Inside was a single line. He carried us. Now let us carry his story. No signature. But he didn't need one. That day, the young sergeant wasn't alone. At stop 5, a woman, boarded with a service ribbon on her lapel. At stop 8, 2 elderly men stepped on, both veterans, nodding silently. By stop 10, Gerald realized something unusual. No one was speaking. No phones, no earbuds, just quiet presence. At stop 12, the bus was full. And when Gerald looked in the mirror, every face was turned toward him. At the base gate, a camera crew waited, not media. Military. They stepped aboard and asked, politely. For a moment, we're documenting stories of service for the Bundeswehr Memorial Archive, one said. We've been trying to reach you for a year. Gerald didn't answer, but the young sergeant stood. With your permission, Sergeant Keller, I'll speak. Gerald's fingers tightened on the wheel, then slowly released. The sergeant turned to the camera. You asked for stories. Let me tell you one. There was a man who once led a unit through a corridor of fire. Not a general, not a politician, just a field sergeant. When the radios failed and the command lines broke, he carried the wounded. He buried the lost. He refused evacuation until every civilian had crossed the line. That man saved my father. That man saved dozens more. And that man drives this bus every day with the same discipline, same quiet, same strength. You call it service. He calls it duty. We call it Gerald Keller. Silence. One by one, passengers stood. Not in applause, in salute. Gerald didn't speak. He simply pulled the lever, opened the doors, and nodded. The young sergeant stepped off. But before he did, he turned. You taught us how to stand, even when no one sees. Now we stand for you. That night, Gerald didn't go home immediately. Instead, he drove to the cemetery. For the first time, he spoke aloud at her grave. They know now, he said, not everything, but enough. Then he sat, and for a while, just let the silence breathe beside him. The next morning, he was earlier than usual. At 5:30 a.m., he stood by bus 17 in full uniform, pressed, polished, whole, not to prove anything, not to fight back, but because sometimes the quietest truth is the one that finally breaks the noise. The weeks that followed didn't bring fanfare. There were no parades, no headlines, no sudden transformation of Gerald's modest life. And yet, everything had changed. Passengers still boarded quietly. But now their silence was not avoidance, it was reverence. Students removed earbuds. Office workers offered gentle nods. Elderly passengers, once indifferent, began greeting him with a respectful Morgan, Herr Keller. They still didn't know every detail. They didn't need to. What mattered had shifted. At the depot, mechanics began referring to bus 17 as Keller's line. Someone installed a small plaque above the driver's seat. It simply read, Er durch Pflicht, honor through duty. Gerald never asked who paid for it. He began receiving small notes tucked into ticket slots, a hand-drawn thank you card from a child, a folded paper star with a quote from a soldier's handbook, a picture of an old battlefield with "Thank you for coming home" scrawled beneath it. But most profound was the change in how he was seen, not as a hero, not as a symbol, but as a man whose life had mattered in silence and now, finally, in memory. The young sergeant whose name was revealed to be Matthias continued to ride. Not every day, but enough. Sometimes they spoke. Mostly they didn't need to. One Friday morning, Gerald handed Matthias a small envelope without a word. Inside was an old photo, faded, creased at the edges, a unit of young men crouched in dusty terrain. One of them, front and center, bore the same stillness Matthias carried now, on the back. In worn ink, Gerald had written, "Not forgotten," not erased, just quiet. Matthias kept it in his uniform pocket from that day forward. One day in late spring, a passenger stepped onto the bus carrying a folded newspaper. The headline was modest: "Bus driver's quiet legacy finds voice in Bundeswehr archives." The article recounted only broad strokes: his rank, the unit he served with, the location of his deployments, no tales of valor, no embellished heroics. But beneath the text, there was a single quote: "We salute not just what he did, but how he never needed to say it." Gerald didn't display the article. He didn't frame it. He folded it gently and placed it in a showbox next to his medals. What mattered more to him was something else entirely. It happened one rainy afternoon when an elderly woman boarded, struggling with her umbrella, her shopping bags trembling in fragile arms. Before Gerald could rise, a young man in the back stood, helped her settle, and offered his seat. He wore no uniform, but his gesture carried discipline, care, and quiet dignity. As the bus pulled away, Gerald caught the young man's eye in the mirror. The boy nodded, not out of obligation, but because he had seen what respect looked like. Gerald knew, in that moment, the echo had traveled farther than medals or memorials ever could. It lived in small moments, in learned empathy, in passing the unspoken torch of service, not by declaring it but by living it. On the anniversary of his retirement, Gerald didn't tell anyone. He drove his final route like any other, arrived early, checked the lights, waved at the depot crew. But as he pulled into stop 12, the stop where it all changed, he saw something waiting he hadn't expected. Every seat was filled. Some passengers were familiar, others not. Matthias stood near the door. He said nothing. He simply stepped aboard and saluted. One by one, the passengers followed. Not a word spoken. Just a bus full of standing silence. The kind of silence that means respect, that means thank you, that means we saw you. Gerald Keller stepped down from the bus that day, not as a forgotten man but as one whose quiet years had spoken volumes. He walked home slowly, alone but not lonely, because dignity, once overlooked, had been restored. And in a world that too often confuses noise with worth, Gerald proved that the deepest legacies are the ones lived, not spoken. Sometimes, the people who shape our world the most are the ones who ask for nothing in return. No applause, no recognition, just the quiet satisfaction of a duty lived well. Gerald Keller reminds us that respect isn't about titles or noise, it's about presence, integrity, and service that endures even when no one's watching. In every city, every bus, every hallway, there's someone like him, invisible only until we choose to see. If this story moved you, leave a comment with one word that captures what Gerald represents to you. Perhaps word, dignity, or air, honor, whatever it is. Let it be a reminder: kindness and respect don't need ceremony. They just need to be passed on. And if someone in your life has quietly carried more than you ever realized, maybe today's the day to thank them, because sometimes one small salute changes everything.